I'm Ben Behunin with the Bread Brothers, and tonight I'm going to be talking to you about sourdough. We're going to start a batch of sourdough bread, but sourdough is a kind of a unique bread in that it takes a long time to rise. The yeast is kind of a naturally occurring yeast, and it requires a long time to rise. So I usually start it typically on a Saturday evening. About 8 or 9 o'clock. It's about 9 o'clock now on Saturday, and I do this on Saturday nights because I like to do what I call Sourdough Sunday, and Bert and I will explain a little bit about what Sourdough Sunday is at some future point. But there are two rises associated with sourdough. The first rise takes about 10 to 12 hours, and the second rise requires about 4 or 5 hours. So I get started on Saturday evening, so on Sunday morning I can break it into loaves and let it do the second rise, and then usually bake it around noon or 1 o'clock. Okay, so Bert and I do our sourdough a little bit differently. Bert he likes to follow a recipe, and I like to break the rules with most everything in life. When I first got started with sourdough, I actually got my first start probably 6 or 7 years ago, and it sat in the fridge because I started Googling and watching YouTube videos about sourdough, and it seemed really daunting and overwhelming, and there were like 10 steps and they all had to be followed at just the right time, and I thought, this isn't for me. I'm not this kind of a baker. But a friend of mine gave me a start probably about 1.5 years ago, and I decided I wanted to learn how to do it this time, and I wanted to do it in a way that was much easier. And so I took like the 10 steps or 12 steps that most people have, and I kind of looked through them and I said, well, this isn't really necessary, and this isn't really necessary, and why do you need to mix it by hand, and why do you... I'm not a purist. I like things that are simple and easy and no fail. So, lots of times people will pull out their sourdough starts and feed them like 1.5 hours or 3 hours before they want to use them. And I just said, I don't really think that's necessary. And so I just began experimenting and playing around and trying to make things as simple as possible. And so my goal is to teach you how to do sourdough in a more simple way. So the first thing that you have to do is to pull your sourdough starts out of the fridge. You keep them in the fridge because if you keep them on the counter, if you're using them every day, that's great. But if you leave them on the counter, they'll eventually run out of food and die. The yeast, the natural occurring yeast in sourdough it requires food to be fed. It requires food to grow. So I keep 2 starts in my fridge at all times because people are regularly asking me for a start, and so I'm feeding it regularly, and then I also like to bake every week, and I often double the recipe, and I don't have a huge jar and I don't have a huge amount of space in my fridge, so I've just kind of had 2, and I'm going to show you what these 2 look like. This one here was fed probably on Thursday when I shared a start, and this one hasn't been fed since last week. So you can see this one's a little bit thicker. It was fed on Thursday, so it's still kind of bubbly. This one over here was not fed since last Saturday, and there's water that's formed on top. A lot of people will pour that water off and will discard it, and sourdough needs to be sour, and that's part of the sourness. So I actually just stir it right back in. So again, I pulled this out of the fridge just minutes ago. What I usually do is I feed it with about 3/4 cup of flour and 3/4 cup of water. Now, some people will weigh these things out and get everything right and make a big science project out of it. I'm not that guy. I just want to make it simple, and so I'm just going to add 3/4 cup of flour. So these now both have 3/4 cup of flour and 3/4 cup of water that have been added to the starch that was already existing in there. And I'm just going to stir that up real well. This takes just maybe a minute per jar to get that all mixed in. The reason you might ask why I'm adding 3/4 cup to each, so that allows me to be able to pull 1 cup of starch out of each jar and be able to add that to my mixer, to my recipe. So pretty quick and easy. Go all the way down to the bottom and bring the old sourdough up and mix it with the flour and water that I just added. You can see these jars are kind of gunky, and I clean them off every once in a while, but this is the jar, the original jar that my friend gave me to start in a year and a half ago. This is kind of a bit of a crazy science experiment. It's a little bit different every week, largely dependent on the temperature in your house. Probably has something to do with the phase of the moon, but it's kind of a crazy experiment. So I hope I'm making this as easy as possible, because it really is much easier than most people make it. And so there I have that mixed up. That's the first thing I do when I make, whenever I make sourdough bread, is I pull those out of the fridge and feed them. A lot of people, like I've said before, will take an hour and a half to 3 hours to kind of watch that grow. I put these rubber bands on these jars years ago, or at least a year and a half ago on this one, and when I started this one probably a year ago, I put the rubber bands on there just so I can see it grow sometimes in the fridge to make sure it continues to be active. But I've never had a problem. I just continued to feed it about once a week. At one point I waited about 2 weeks, actually 3 weeks. We were away in India and I didn't bake for 3 weeks, and it needed to be woken up a little bit and take a little bit more time to grow. That first batch after I got back from India required a little bit more time to activate and grow, but it was still fine. It went great. Okay. So I fed the starch, I've got my flour, I've got my salt, and I'm just going to measure some water now. So the next step, I'm going to add the water to the mixer. I'm adding 2 cups, I'm doubling the batch. So if you don't want to double batch, half this, and I'll put the recipe up a little later, but this will make about 2 sandwich-sized loaves of bread, or about 7 of the smaller loaves that you'll see tomorrow when I break these into the different pans. So I'm just going to go ahead and add 2 cups of water, 2 tablespoons of salt, and then 6 cups of flour. And then the 4th ingredient is the starch, and I will take 1 cup out of each of these jars that I've just been working with. And see, it's goopy and fun to work with. Now, a lot of people that work with sourdough only use a small amount. I don't know why I use this much, but I want a kind of a more soury taste, and I figure the more you add, the better it's going to taste. So pretty quick and easy. You notice I added all of this together at the same time rather than adding a little bit and then adding more. This just, the The Bosch makes it so nice. I have done this all by hand, and you totally can do it by hand. It's just more messy and a little bit more time consuming, but the Bosch sure makes it nice and easy. So I'm just gonna kick this on. All right, so this has been mixing for probably about 4 minutes, and I'm just gonna pull out the bread hook. It's pretty sticky right now, and I just spread this out a little bit, and I'm just gonna let this rise overnight, right in this pot connected to the mixer. I put the lid on to keep it from drying out, and that'll just sit for about 10 to 12 hours. Hopefully tomorrow morning it will be up around the lid, and I'll be able to pour it out and break it into the loaf tins. I get to clean up now. The biggest mess is right here. There'll be a little bit more mess tomorrow, but I'll put these back in the fridge. One thing I should say is if you have a choice between jars, I would highly recommend getting one that the lid just pops off rather than one that screws off. If you happen to forget and leave this out after you feed this, it literally can become like a dry ice bomb. The pressure can build up so much that it can actually explode the jar, and that could be a huge mess. If you put it back in the fridge, that's going to retard the growth of the natural yeast, and so it's not going to be an issue. But if you leave it out, it will for sure be a problem. The lid on this is just a press lid, so you can pick those up at any kitchen store. One thing I should mention too is that sourdough, it's really messy in that if you don't wash this off quickly, it can become almost permanent. I don't know what it is, just the way the water activates with the natural yeast and the flour. I try to make a point of always cleaning this up as quickly as possible, even washing it out of the sink, because it kind of becomes like a wheat paste and can be really nasty to clean off. So take care of your kitchen, clean all this stuff up. I'm just going to let that sit until tomorrow, and we're going to be good. Good morning. So the sourdough has had a chance to rise overnight. It is now about nearly 8:30 on Sunday morning, and I'm ready to divide these up into loaves and to allow them to rise the second time. So the dough has risen not nearly as much as it normally would have. It was cold in our house last night. Because it snowed yesterday, it's still kind of cold outside, so it's probably doubled in size. Lots of times I like to come in on Sunday morning and find it up to right about here. So I have come in before when I did this last summer, and it actually pushed right up against the lid. So yeast grows with heat, and so it needs a little bit of heat in order to rise. The second rise, I may have to, because it's cold in the house, I may have to put these loaf tins in the oven on warm, just to get it to proof a little bit faster. So this dough's really pretty sticky, and I'm going to drop that right onto the countertop with a decent amount of flour on it, and just clean out the bowl the best I can. All of this dough will become bread, so don't waste it. I sprinkle a little bit more on top, and then this is a really handy tool. This is called a bench scraper or a dough cutter. What I'm going to do with that is just kind of eyeball this and cut this into seven loaves. So I have these little tins that I like to use for sourdough Sunday, because when I invite people over to enjoy it, it's nice to be able to just enjoy smaller pieces, and they can eat as many as they like. But if I don't give it all away, then when people come here, then I'll go out to deliver it around the neighborhood. And a lot of the folks that I give it to are single people, so a large loaf of bread can be a little bit overwhelming. So again, I just try to eyeball this with 7 equal pieces. And then it's fairly quick. You'll see videos of people stretching their sourdough and making it all funky and pretty, and I don't really do that. I just kind of roll it into a decent size, decent shape, and put a little flour, kind of cake that on the top, and drop it right into the tin. So it's just a matter of folding the dough underneath, kind of shaping it into kind of a chubby Twinkie, and then dropping it right into the tin. So you don't need to worry too much about filling in all of the corners there. The dough will expand and do that by itself. So just chubby Twinkies. It's like happy trees. Okay. So a friend of mine was saying that sourdough takes about 10 minutes and 24 hours, or 10 minutes and at least 12 hours to complete. So the actual hands-on time really isn't that long, but the waiting for the dough to rise takes a considerable amount of time. So you kind of need to plan for that. You can't wake up in the morning and say, I'm going to have fresh bread for lunch. So the reason to put the flour on the top, two things. When I cut it later on, it allows the design to show up better, but it also allows it to not stick to the cloth that I'm going to put over the top of this. I started putting these all on a cookie sheet to rise a little while ago. It's because it's really easy to move around if I have to, rather than moving 7 pieces. It's just one movement. So I'm just going to let this rise now for about 4 or 5 hours. Okay, so it's now noon on Sunday, and these have risen a little bit, but not as much as I'd like. So I'm going to force this to rise a little bit faster by putting them in a warm oven. And so the oven's just about, I'm going to guess, like 150 degrees. So I'll just put them in there, and at the same time I'm going to turn on my second oven. If you only have one oven, not a big deal. I fortunately have 2, so I can warm on the bottom and turn the other oven on to 450 degrees. I'm going to let that rest now for probably about 20 minutes and check it out in 20 minutes to see what that looks like. You'll be really surprised at how much it grows when there's a little bit more heat involved in the equation. All right, so I just pulled this out of the oven, just on the warm setting. It's warm, but I can still grab it with my hands, so it's not like, I'm guessing it's probably like 130 degrees maybe. So I'm just going to pull this off. You can recognize that it has risen quite a lot. There are a couple of areas here that just need to be kind of smoothed down with the flour that was on there. So maybe it's like right there, just needs to be kind of smoothed out a little bit. And then I just take my razor blade and I'm just going to carve some different designs. I often carve a leaf in these, or just slashes. You can do all sorts of fun things with this and just have some fun with it. It's kind of like drawing in bread. So don't be shy. Just kind of have fun with whatever it is you're doing, and And we'll make that one look like a football. Okay, so you recognize how quickly that went, and you'll see the design show up a lot more as this rises even more as it's baking. So I have the oven set at 450 degrees. I've got a broiler pan underneath and into which I will pour some water to steam the bread to give it a nice artisan crust. So we'll move over there right now. Okay, so I'm going to set the timer for about 30 minutes. If I was doing a larger loaf, I might want to go a little bit longer, but these smaller loaves bake really fast. I'm excited to show you what they're going to look like when they're all done. All right, it's turned out awesome. These bake for about 25 minutes actually. So with the smaller pans, they really don't need the longer bake time. So I obviously didn't eyeball these incredibly well with the dough that I put in this morning. So we have some bigger ones and some smaller ones, but I think they all turned out really pretty. I'm going to be able to take these out and deliver them a little later on this afternoon, but they'll be ready to cut into in about 10 minutes. So like I said before, it takes about 10 minutes of hands-on time and about, well, let's see, it's now 1 o'clock. Just burnt myself. Now 1 o'clock, and I started last night about 9 o'clock. So that is 16 hours from start to finish. Again, only 10 hours of hands-on time, but 16 hours altogether to create what we created today. So sourdough is awesome. It's really good for your gut. A lot of people that have trouble with gluten intolerance can eat sourdough without much trouble. A lot of people have yeast issues that can eat sourdough, but not other types of breads that have yeast in them. So lots of great options, lots of great potential to go in different directions. In a future videos, I'll be showing just single loaves and loaves that rise in a banatone and other things. So pay attention to the videos that we'll be posting. And if you like us, leave a comment and subscribe and share with your friends. Thanks.